it occurred to me that a lot of the labor that I was doing for higher ed that was useful and productive, fruitful, supportive for the people who were benefiting from it, students, administration, was still not being rewarded or valued on the end of year annual review. So it was literally giving away labor for free. And so I was not in a position to continue to do that, especially because it's a lot of labor and you have to sort of wrestle other folks to support you. And we're all doing this work on the side of our desk. And so when I started looking into what it would take to register a business name and what it would take to get a small business lawyer, I had more time to wrestle with those questions, develop a business plan, and think about what consulting could look like during the pandemic when everyone was back home.
Welcome to Leaving Academia, Becoming a Freelance Editor, the podcast. I'm your host, Paulina Cossette. In 2019, I was a political science professor who was fed up with the stress and hostility of academia, not to mention the low pay. I left my tenure-track job and went from barely surviving to thriving as a freelance academic editor. Today, I own Acadia Editing Services, an editing and coaching business that brings in 6 figures a year. In this podcast, I'll discuss the challenges of academia, what academic editing involves, and what life as a freelancer looks like. If you're willing to jump outside your comfort zone, it is possible to find joy, true flexibility, and a profitable and rewarding career as an academic editor. Thanks for listening. Today on the podcast, I am speaking with Dr. Rachel LaTouche. Rachel is the CEO and principal consultant at Rare Talent Consulting, where she collaborates with a network of aligned experts to strengthen leadership, workplace culture, and professional development to help organizations become adaptive workplaces that attract top talent and align dynamically to a rapidly changing world. Rachel is also launching the Consulting Futures Lab, which is a 3-month pilot program that helps academics and professionals align their work with their values by reimagining new possibilities in consulting. Rachel's 2026 cohort begins in mid-February, and she is going to chat with us more about that later on. Welcome to the podcast, Rachel.
Thank you for having me, Paulina.
So let's start with your journey in academia. What is your academic background, and tell us how that evolved?
Yeah, so my PhD is in sociology. I'm Canadian born. I got my PhD in the US at Indiana University, and my research background is in organizational culture and mental health. So while in grad school and while training, that meant I studied graduate student departments and how well they resourced their students and what could be done better in terms of the structure and resourcing so that more graduate students would be healthy and also be able to finish. So that's my background there. I moved into faculty life after grad school. I had a very traditional trajectory. Applied the year before I was finished my PhD, got a job back in Canada, moved back here, and started faculty life in a tenure position at the University of Toronto. Was there for 5 years and moved to another university, and then decided to change things up entirely and move into a completely different world of consulting.
So when you mentioned what you studied in grad school, that sounds both interesting and potentially depressing to me. I'm curious, maybe let me ask it this way. There must have been a connection there, right, with studying grad student departments and culture of those departments, and then now what you do, which is working on workplace culture. So how did your idea for your business maybe come out of your research?
Yeah, because I wasn't intending from the very start to go into working for myself, I didn't see that link until a little bit later. When I was in grad school, I was in a department that had a very strong set of mental health scholars. So I was going to move into some mental health work, I think, one way or another. My fascination with how departments resourced graduate students came from seeing the very high dropout rate amongst graduate departments and really high rates of alcoholism. So I was starting with on the ground observation and recognizing that the institution I belong to and many others that graduate friends at other institutions belong to were not properly resourcing their needs. And in fact, we're structuring resources much more to the undergraduate population. So I started to take a fascination with that, studied that, learned a lot in that process, and then was going to move into faculty life and just continue to study the relationship between organizational structure and mental health broadly. I wasn't necessarily going to continue studying students, but I was interested in how the environments we spend a lot of time in shape the way we think about mental health, the way we talk about mental health, the way we ignore or pay attention to certain types of triggers, etc. And then when I got into faculty life and saw a number of the issues that existed in graduate school exacerbated and far worse in faculty life, I realized there was much more to be said than just what was happening in graduate school. And that, in fact, we could look at work broadly, where we spend a substantial proportion of our lifetime, and what we could do at the organizational level to make it easier for the incumbents of those places. And so some of the things that I was seeing in faculty life really drove and motivated me to want to study this more. And when I chose to leave faculty life, I realized it wasn't because my passion for that research and that area had changed, but that the environment in which I wanted to do that kind of work needed to change. So I kept studying it and realizing that there were a number of organizations that needed HR adjacent or people operations adjacent resourcing that I could support.
The link with alcoholism too that you mentioned is interesting. When I was in grad school, it was a relatively supportive department. It wasn't like one of these places where they haze you. And, my advisor was very supportive and always concerned about me, but there still weren't structures in place for mental health. And I struggled a lot. I got divorced when I was in grad school. I got married and divorced when I was in grad school. I felt lost. I was really depressed for a long time. And there was nothing like trying, the university obviously had a wellness center, counseling center, but it's when you're in that place, it's hard to find your way out on your own, I think. And I was lucky that I went to therapy and got better. And then just thinking about, like you said, how it's exacerbated when people become faculty. We could have a whole podcast episode on this, but that's not what we're doing today. At what point, so when you were faculty, you realized that you didn't want to continue in that environment. At what point did you realize, what consulting was and that was an option for you? Because I think a lot of faculty, we are so trained to think that we're going to be professors for the rest of our lives. We don't even think about outside options. So I'm curious if you can talk us through that process of how you realized this was an alternative and how you made it happen.
Yeah, this is a really great question, and I get it often. It's interesting because I had a number of colleagues who were a few years out from my coming into higher ed as faculty who, after seeing what I did, so I was really, really invested in particularly student development and seeing gaps in student development and trying to fill them. And I had a lot of faculty a few years ahead of me who would reach out to me personally and say, "Have you ever thought about consulting? You should have an LLC, or you should be doing this work on the side. You're essentially giving free labor away to the university." And I didn't really know what consulting meant. It was just sort of a term that people used. And I was like, yeah, okay, cool. I'll look into it, not quite knowing what exactly that meant. But then I started to see that some of them had their own LLCs or they had their own projects that they were doing on the side. And so I just asked them, what does that look like? And how did you get into it? And where did you start? And how difficult is it to balance on the side? The questions that you need logistically to figure out if that's something that was of interest to you. But I didn't take the questions or even the suggestions that I should do it seriously until far later. So when the pandemic hit, George Floyd died, and the sort of social political climate outside and inside of higher ed was changing quite rapidly. And I realized, oh, I need to take this more seriously. Like, I need to think a little bit more about what consulting could look like if I chose to do it. So those initial questions gave me a sense of the shape, the scope, what legally I needed to have in order to start doing that kind of work. And it occurred to me that a lot of the labor that I was doing for higher ed that was useful and productive, fruitful, supportive for the people who were benefiting from it, students, administration, was still not being rewarded or valued on the end of year annual review. So it was literally giving away labor for free. And so I was not in a position to continue to do that, especially because it's a lot of labor and you have to sort of wrestle other folks to support you. And we're all doing this work on the side of our desk. And so when I started looking into what it would take to register a business name and what it would take to get a small business lawyer, I had more time to wrestle with those questions, develop a business plan, and think about what consulting could look like during the pandemic when everyone was back home. So I was teaching from home. I got maybe 2.5 hours back in my day from no longer commuting. And I just channeled that 2.5 hours a day into developing a business and figuring out what that looked like. It was a lot of patchwork at the beginning. Some things really didn't make sense and they weren't on any particular timeline. But I knew that I wanted an option to have the value of the work that I was doing on the side of my desk equal the compensation. And so bit by bit, I started to figure that out.
Yeah, it's funny how universities will extract more and more of our time and our labor, and yet there's never money for a raise or anything like that. But yet we somehow find the energy. We dig it out of ourselves. We find the
That's
time and the
right.
energy to pour into our students, to pour into the university, to the discipline. And then you stop and you wait a minute and you go, okay, I could spend this time as billable hours
That's
instead.
right.
And instead of continuing to give more and more and produce more and more, you start to produce in an exchange where you're actually getting
Yes.
paid for your skills and your knowledge and your energy. So how and when did you land your first clients? Was it during the pandemic when you were still faculty or after you left?
Yeah, it was during the pandemic while I was still faculty. So I sort of started my business part time. And that's one of the benefits of consulting. You get to decide how many hours you're pouring into it and then what you get out of it accordingly. So I started part time. I got my first client on Upwork. So a contract site where you can just let people know what you do and what you do well, put an hourly rate that you think is fair or appropriate for what you do. And then you can pitch to people, or people can say, hey, I think you might be a good candidate for what I want to do. Would you like to talk about it in an interview? And I wasn't super familiar with Upwork before that, but I did talk to some folks who had worked on there before and had some really lucrative contracts. And some folks who also maybe were interested less in the money and really wanted to try and see what they could get in terms of relationship building and what industries they could move into by offering their services kind of piecemeal. So I decided to give it a try. My first client was a big client somehow. So I ended up working for a faculty member at the University of Pittsburgh who was interested in working on her portfolio for promotion. And it wasn't organizational culture quite yet, but it was absolutely within my skill set. It was something that I had contributed to for other folks' profiles and portfolios going up for promotion in my faculty life, whether by writing letters or helping them to edit their own materials. So I decided that this was a worthwhile project to take on, that it would help to get a client with some name recognition sort of out the gate, and that it would really give me a sense of whether or not I even liked the work, right? It was kind of low stakes in the sense that, okay, I'll sign on to this project. It's for a limited term. If I really hate it, I'll just complete it and then I won't do this kind of work again. I'll try something else. And so I helped this faculty member go up for promotion. She was promoted, and that process went really well. My relationship with her continues. And with that being my first client and not quite knowing what services I was fully ready to offer on my own, I didn't have a website yet. I took my experience from that, got a review from her. And then a year later, this same person became chair of her department and wanted to run a promotions program for all faculty in her program who were going up for promotion. And she reached back out and was like, hey, you did this for me and it was really successful and I enjoyed the process. Could you run a program for 14 people at a time? It's like, yeah, absolutely, I can. And so as these things kind of go, sometimes opportunities land in your lap and you're like, if I think I have the capacity, I should really try this, right? I should really go for it. And so then I was able to do that a year and a half later for the folks in her department. So it wasn't my second client. There were clients in between there. But yeah, my first client was through Upwork.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I want to really highlight that for people because I think one of the biggest barriers to people's success is just that they're scared to start. And as academics, we feel like everything has to be perfect. All our T's have to be crossed and our I's have to be dotted before we put ourselves out there. And I just want to reiterate what you said, that when you started, it was messy. You didn't have a website. You figured, well, I'll just put something up on Upwork and see what happens, and you figured you were going to try. And if you said if you don't like it, you just won't continue. And that's amazing, that you that's exactly how it should be, right? For anybody who's considering and debating and they're not sure, it's a very low risk, virtually no investment, other than some time to create a profile and to put yourself out there. And I love that, a year later, when this client came back to you wanting further support, which probably required more structure, you were ready, right? You'd been doing it for a year. You were a lot more confident. You had served other clients. And at that point, you were ready to serve her and help her in that way. So I think that's a great story and great example of how it can begin for folks is you just start with your first client and you see where it goes. Because we all might seem like we know what we're doing all the time, but I think for most of us business owners, we are really kind of taking it one day at a time and seeing where things go.
Absolutely.
So the program that you offered to this department about promotion, is that the sort of thing is that the direction that your business has evolved towards, or what does your consulting business mainly do today?
Yeah, no, my consulting business does different things now. I think when I was first in that early transition point, I was sticking very closely to higher ed, and that made sense. I was comfortable with higher ed. I knew the norms, the rules, the expectations. And so and some of the clients who were coming to me were directly from higher ed, so it made sense. As I started to get firmer on what I wanted my business to be, and as I became clearer about the fact that I was completely leaving higher ed, I decided that it didn't make sense to have all my, eggs in that basket. And so I wanted to think about organizations a little more broadly and talent development. And I didn't want to think about it in the sort of narrow pathway that HR is, especially because I have a background in equity. I wanted to make sure that I was not another sector of an organization that simply supported the organization only. I really wanted to support the employees, right? I really wanted the experience for the employees to be better. And so I targeted myself towards organizations who were losing talent, right? Or had talent that was underdeveloped or undeveloped in their own organization. And that was helpful because, as many employees have expressed to me in all of the data collection and interviews and focus groups that I do in my work, is that HR is seen as protecting the institution only, right? They're essentially there to make sure that the organization is not at risk and that there is no legal liability. When it comes to supporting talent and making sure that folks are not underemployed, that they're not being underutilized, that they're collaborating and cross training so that they're learning new things, keeping sharp and on their toes. That was not being done in a number of institutions. And it was a large part of the reason organizations were losing talent. So I really wanted to serve in that area, which is not unrelated to things like promotion, but it's not exactly the same as running promotion programs for higher ed institutions. So I started pivoting the services I wanted to offer towards talent development. So that could be anything from leadership development, folks who are interested in being promoted in the year to come or in a year and a half from now and want to develop the skills for the next role so that they can hit the ground running. Sometimes I'm working with leaders who are changing industries, so they need a slightly different skill set than the one that they were using in their last role. That's helpful because it helps me to draw on what it meant to move from higher ed to what I do now. And so I work with organizations that are losing talent or that are unable to attract top talent so that their culture, both internally as well as what they're signaling to the public, are aligned. A little bit different than what I first started doing, but also a kind of a natural evolution for me.
So it sounds like it's the organization that hires you, and then you come in and work one on one with individuals.
Yeah, sometimes I work one on one, but often I work with teams.
Okay.
So an organization will hire me, usually the leader, someone who has some decision making power about how their budget gets used. And I will help that leader and their team. So sometimes the leader is new in the role and they want to make sure that they gel really well with their team and that they're working effectively, communicating effectively. Project management processes are in place so that they're collecting data, they're analyzing data, and updating their processes as they go. Sometimes when there is a leadership turnover that's temporary, so mat leave replacement, you end up with some friction in that temporary change management. I've had leaders hire me for that. I've also had organizations that are very, very committed to what they need to be doing from a DEI perspective that they weren't doing before. And now they have budget to do so, but they don't have expertise in house. They don't have people who have that training or that background or that research. And so they want people to come in and train them so that as they start to hire a more and more diverse workplace, they're hiring people into an environment that's safe and healthy. So it's sort of been in that broad spectrum, but it's always targeted towards making the workplace healthier, making the environment healthier so that people want to work there and the people who are there stay.
So so most of the people that I have on the podcast are what we would call, well, editors, of course, but also coaches, where they're essentially, in terms of their marketing, they are blogging, they are posting on social media, either LinkedIn or Instagram usually, and they're speaking directly to individuals who want to change their career or publish more or whatever. It's more of like a B2C, right? Business to consumer or business to client form of marketing. So I'm curious, it sounds like you're doing more of B2B, business to business. How do you approach that? Are people mainly finding you on LinkedIn, or how do most people discover you?
Yeah, it's a good question. Because I started with B2B, like it was an individual client that was my very, very first one. And of course, I didn't even at the time that I was being hired by her, didn't know what B2B and B2C means, just so that anyone else out here thinking about business development knows there's so much you don't know at the beginning. So, you know, I was I was really happy to work with her. And then a year and a half later, when she was like, "Hey, I'm hiring you now to work with my entire department," I realized how different those two ways of working were, not just in terms of the day to day work, but also just from a bureaucratic paperwork standpoint. At that point, it was the University of Pittsburgh hiring me. The first time it was her individually. So just the process was also very different. But I'm almost 5 years in now, I'm realizing that for me, having both of those services or some services in each of those areas has been really helpful for the ebb and flow of all things entrepreneurial. But the B2B stuff, I'm getting clients from LinkedIn. I do a lot of writing and posting on LinkedIn, and I have a presence there that has been slowly growing, despite the algorithm, but slowly growing. And I've had a lot of folks contact me that way. I also now have a whole host of folks who are still in higher ed, who run departments, who chair committees, who are interested in services for themselves or for folks that they know. So I get a lot of referrals that way. But one of the interesting ways that I've also found people have found me is from past clients. I've had a number of past clients refer me to other folks that they know in other industries, at other organizations. So when they need workshops or training, or they need a longer retainer, or they're like, hey, we've got a huge merger happening and a lot of teams are shaking up. They're a little bit on unstable ground. Could you come in and help us smooth out this transition? So I've had a number of clients that way. And then I'm also fortunate, and I'll figure this out maybe in about year three, that you can work for other consultancies. Other consultancies sometimes have much too much work. And if you tell them what your area of expertise is and they have work in your area that's overflow, they subcontract it out to you. They hire you to work with their clients. So I've also done work with larger consultancies and been able to subcontract my area of expertise in people operations.
And did those consultancies find you, or did you do like some cold outreach or anything like that? They realized they needed more help and they found you.
Yeah, I've had one find me just from LinkedIn. And then because I'm really fortunate that even when I was in grad school, I had a number of friends that I grew up with that I'm still friends with now who work in industries that have nothing to do with higher ed. And I'm grateful because now that I work with those kinds of organizations, every single time I'm looking for new clientele or looking to grow or spread out, I can send an email blast to these people in my own network and say, hey, talk to the people in your own organizations or the folks that you know and see if this is of interest to them. See if this is something that they'd be, interested in looking into. And one of my opportunities to work with a larger consultancy came from a friend who heard about an opportunity and was like, hey, I don't know if this is something you'd be interested in doing, but they've posted that they are looking for contractors in people operations. That's what you do, as I understand it. Maybe you should apply. So I applied to be one of their external staff members, is what they call them, an external contractor. So I'm on their website, I'm on their roster. People know what I do. I've got a bio there. And then clients that come in who have work in people operations, they can subcontract out to me. So one of my longer standing relationships with these bigger consultancies came through a friend.
Yeah, I think that's another excellent point is that I know a lot of people in my program, when they're learning to become an editor or a coach, they are terrified to admit out loud or publicly that they are doing this, right? It feels almost shameful to be starting a business.
Right.
Or they can't, and they can't just start posting on LinkedIn that they're becoming a publishing coach or something because their department might retaliate against them or something. But that doesn't mean that you can't market yourself. Like you're saying, reach out to friends from different corners of your life. Maybe it's friends from your childhood or friends from undergrad, or maybe it's parents of your child's friends or whatever, right? We all move in different circles. It could be, chatting with somebody at the grocery store or the library or something. As long as you are out and about, talk about what you do, because you never know who will hear it and go, oh, I know somebody who could use that, or here's a connection. I think people love to connect other people and be helpful, and it doesn't, you don't have to say a word to your department or anybody at your actual job, your day job about it.
That's exactly right. And I think today, like in the modern age of being able to have a personal website, or you can have two LinkedIn pages, you can have your personal LinkedIn page, you can have a business LinkedIn page. There are options to separate those more or less depending on your comfort, depending on your situation. I think the retaliation piece from departments is very real and it's an incredibly valid concern. and it's one that should be taken seriously. And there are workarounds. There are workarounds if you want to do that. There are folks who are not interested in leaving higher ed, but they still want to do consulting on the side because they recognize they're giving away a lot of free labor. There are ways to do that where they don't have to overlap or cross. There are also a number of faculty and academics I know that have personal websites where they do include their own research as well as what they do from a consulting standpoint, but it's just separate from their, university or administrative profile. So there are ways.
Yeah. How did you get the idea for this, for your new program? Tell us about that.
Yeah. The Consulting Futures Lab. Yeah, that's interesting. So again, it's this interesting, like always one foot kind of near or close to higher ed. I haven't completely broken free, maybe. But I've had a number of graduate students, former colleagues, reach out to me in the last year and a half, especially because there are a lot of changes happening in higher ed right now. And of course, they're happening more broadly than that, but they're rippling through higher ed environments. So I had a number of folks reach out to me in the last year and a half who have seen the work that I've been doing on LinkedIn. We're becoming more aware, I guess, of the publicness, the publicity of that profile, and have been asking me the questions that I was asking when I was first trying to figure this out. So, how did you get into consulting? What is it that you do? Who do you work with? And a number of folks were like, why? Like, why did you leave higher ed for this? Like, tell me a little bit about the pros and cons of that. And so it really pushed to me the recognition that there are a lot of gaps in information for folks who are interested or curious about what else there is other than higher ed. There are also a number of graduate students and junior colleagues who are in insecure forms of work, whether that's adjuncting, on a yearly basis, or who weren't able to get into tenure track jobs, even though that was their original intention. And so now there are a host of folks who maybe thought their career was going to move in one direction and need to be exploring other options. So just out of the blue, I had a number of folks come and ask me these questions, and I was taking these meetings one-on-one to help folks. And it sort of reminded me of higher ed in the sense that, okay, I want to help people and I want to support people, but I can't do all of this on the side of my desk, right? On top of all the org clients that I have. So if I can make this into a program, if I can try to collapse the things that I've learned, the resources that have been fruitful for me, and also maybe warn some people off some directions that I shouldn't have gone in and that were missteps, then maybe that road to figuring out what consulting could look like for them would be a little smoother. That's how the idea came about. This is the very first iteration of it. I'm curious to see how it goes and who joins. But there is certainly a group of folks who are under-resourced in knowing what their options are and who are really ingrained in the narratives and the norms of higher ed that are very narrowly defined, that say your value is this and this is what you do. And I think some folks are now figuring out that it's not enough. It's not enough. It's not enough for me, and it's not enough for me at this time. And so, yeah, running the first cohort of the Consulting Futures Lab and, hoping to help some folks figure out a path that works better for them and that helps them to reclaim some of the value of their labor.
There is definitely, I think, a transition in the identity that people go through when they decide to join a program like that. It's very similar with what I see in my program and becoming an academic editor or coach, where we don't dwell on that question of like, should I leave academia or how do I leave academia? I don't like to dwell on it because I like to help people focus on the future, of what they're building. But there's definitely an element, I think, of the community support. And I'll be curious to see, what your experience is as you run your community, where people in the group who need to talk about those fears and those doubts and all that, they find each other and they're able to come together and realize that they're in a safe space where they can talk openly and not be judged or criticized or anything. So, yeah, I'll love to hear how that plays out in your group. What is the structure of the program? Is it a set number of weeks? Is there an online course element? Are you going to meet weekly? What is all that going to look like for the cohort?
Yeah, so it's a 3-month guided program. The first cohort, because it's a pilot, is limited spots. So it's exactly 12 weeks. We meet weekly. There are exercises. It is designed to be done with 2 hour investment, so to speak, of homework. And that's because I am not assuming that the folks who are interested in my program have already left higher ed. A lot of folks who have been reaching out are still in higher ed, and they're now straddling the 1 foot out, 1 foot in. So making it reasonable and feasible with a short investment of time, but with exercises and reflection prompts and things that you can do throughout the week. But yes, we meet once a week for an hour. There are a few select weeks that are a little bit longer than an hour because we just need more time to move a little more slowly. But the 3 months are scaffolded so that the very beginning of the program is much more about what you just said, Paulina, the shift in identity, the shift in mindset, and then realizing that you will have community needs that require you to build a community outside of higher ed in order to support whatever your consulting future looks like. And then we start to get into some of the nitty gritty. So, what does getting a business plan together look like? What does registering a business look like? If you're interested in working for yourself, how is that different than doing something on Upwork, for example? Because consulting doesn't have to look one way. Not everybody wants to run their own business, and that makes sense. It's not for everyone. But there are a number of ways that academics and scholars can be outsourcing their labor on like an a la carte, the same way you would think about ordering food maybe at a fancy restaurant. So you can be lending that to a larger project where there's an RFP, a request for proposals. You can be working to cover a mat leave on a contract basis. You can be working on Upwork or some other contract site where you're just doing project based work. And so we decide what that looks like and what's right for you in month 2. And by month 3, you're putting together a portfolio. So that portfolio can be used if you're going on the job market, fully deciding to leave higher ed. That can also be used for Upwork because Upwork does really well when you've got a portfolio that says, here's what I do well, here's how I can add value to you as a client. But it can also be helpful if you want to pitch to a larger consultancy, like I ended up doing at a certain point, and say, hey, if you have work in this area and want to subcontract it out, here's what I do, here's how effective I am at it, and here's how you can reach me. So I wasn't quite sure that 3 months was going to be the right fit, but it is a lot. The transition is a lot, and it requires a slowing down and an intentional resourcing. And so, yeah, I've designed it right now as a 3-month guided program. It runs on the 16th of February, but enrollment opens February 1st. And I'm hoping to help, scholars and academics find a way that works better for them than the road that was open via higher ed.
Mm. Yeah, I love that you emphasize the flexibility of it because I think that's exactly right. You can start like you did, where you just kind of dip your toe in the water when you're still in your faculty role, or maybe you're still a grad student or a postdoc or whatever, and you see if you like it. You take a course like this, you join a community like yours where you're surrounded by people who are going to lift you up and support each other, and you try it out and you learn how to go about it. And I I agree also the 12 weeks I think is a great time frame because you're not just it's not like we just hand you a checklist and say here do these things and make this resume, make this portfolio, whatever, that apply. There is a transition, not just in the identity, but in learning a new way of approaching work. I think that's another aspect of programs like ours that people don't think about or don't even know that they will have to think about is how do I set boundaries around my new role, especially if I'm still in an academic or other job. How do I set boundaries around when I'm going to serve clients or when I'm going to work on these other projects so that I don't burn out? And there's so much to relearn about your relationship with your career and with your labor that we don't really even realize is a question. Something I wanted to touch on also is that I think most people who get in touch with me appreciate the value of paying for a program like this, but occasionally I will get some folks who think, probably from their experience in academia, that we should just be doing this for free, that, oh, your program's too expensive, or I can't afford this on a postdoc salary or something. And just as we're talking, I'm thinking about the knowledge that you and I and other business owners who run programs like this have fought to gain, like you said, I think you said you were doing this 5 or 6 years in your consulting business, and
Mhm.
it's hard, right? When you're teaching yourself, you are learning, you are failing, you are
Yes.
having also successes, but it's not easy. Like there's a lot of late nights and early mornings and effort that you're putting in to learn this, plus the effort that it takes to craft the curriculum or the schedule and the conversations and the marketing of it all. And so I hope that folks appreciate that the money that you spend really is an investment in yourself and in your future, because you're getting so much. You're getting the knowledge, you're getting the mindset shifts, you're getting the community support. And I just love hearing about you. I love hearing you talk about this because it makes me happy to know that there's another place for people like us who are so miserable to find joy doing something else that they love, using their skills and their knowledge in a new way.
Absolutely. And one of the things you said just really is so poignant for me, which is if you are deciding to leave higher ed, and even if you aren't, even if you're just stepping out on this part-time basis, you don't want to replicate the things that don't work for you already in higher ed, in your business or in your consulting. So whether that is, I need to draw stronger boundaries regarding when I work, how I work, and in my case, who I work with, I draw a hard line on who I work with because being values aligned is non negotiable. I was negotiating and compromising that all the time when I was in higher ed because I don't get to choose my colleagues. I don't get to choose who's senior in my department or senior in my university, who tells me what I'm supposed to do and when and what courses I have to teach and when. But as an entrepreneur, as a consultant, I get to decide who I work with. I have turned down work with organizations that I feel we are not values aligned. And that is something that you can do quite firmly and in a really affirming way when you're consulting that is much more difficult when you're working for someone else. So the opportunity to do that and recognize that it makes you healthier, it makes it easier to do good quality work for your clients. I wouldn't trade it.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I think I do talk a lot about boundaries in terms of like time and taking vacation, but I agree completely that setting boundaries on what kind of behavior we will put up with is also really important. I think, well, we've all, I'm sure, especially women in academia, have experienced all kinds of things, but I often think back to like some conversation I had with somebody when I was still teaching, and at the time I just let it go. I just accepted it as like, oh, usually it was a man, like, oh, he's just a jerk, or this is just the way it is. But I think back to those conversations and I'm horrified at like, I would never accept someone talking to me that way anymore. Like it would be an immediate hang up the phone, block their email, whatever, tell them off.
Absolutely.
And so I love that you point that out because that is such an empowering thing about running your own business, is that you get to control everything, including the types of people that you decide to work with.
Yeah.
So what else? Is there anything else we haven't covered? Is there any advice you'd like to give to someone who's kind of on the fence and thinking, oh, I do this research, or I'm really passionate about working with these people, but I'm not sure. Anything else you want to cover that we haven't talked about yet?
I think the only thing, it's not so much that we haven't talked about it, but I would love to double down on something you said far earlier, which is talking about yourself. So, talking about yourself, your work, the things that you're passionate about, you're interested in, especially with audiences that are different than you, has been so fundamental to why my business still exists, why it's still running. That's not something I'm an extreme introvert. So this is something that like I had to sort of get more and more comfortable with and start with some more secure, environments, then move into other environments. But I think practicing that, getting comfortable with that is really important because it means that when you've left a conversation with someone, especially if it's somebody new, if anything you said registers with them, resonates with them, then that person is bringing up your name, your idea, or something interesting that you said to them in another conversation at a later point. So some of the marketing is happening on your behalf because you impressed someone. Not every conversation you're going to have, someone's going to leave impressed. But if you get comfortable with talking about yourself, the work that you do, then your name ends up in several rooms without you always having to cold pitch. I cold pitch occasionally. I don't love to do it. Building relationships has been a much more fruitful way for me to get new contacts, to get referrals, to get new clientele, and even to get ideas about new services. Because you're not just talking at people, people are talking then to you. So, what are they saying? What are they mirroring back? What are they sharing with you that might help you refine a service, develop a new service in the future, or have you consider a new industry or area that you could open up into? All of those conversations are worthwhile. I never feel like they're in vain. And so I hold regular meetings during the year with folks who are doing interesting work on LinkedIn, people I've never met before, people who don't know me. You and I met through a project that was also via on LinkedIn. And so those possibilities would not have been or become real if I was not getting more accustomed to talking about myself. And so I think that's advice that I would share with folks who are maybe thinking about it or it's just talk more and more and more about yourself and listen to what people are saying. And that will help clear the path. It will help you figure out which way to move and when.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And I think that, when we're in academia and we talk about ourselves or our research, it's often from a defensive posture. We're feel like we're always having to defend ourselves to the reviewer or the dissertation committee, or we're at a conference and we're having to defend our ideas to the audience or the whatever the panel, or we're talking about all our accomplishments and our publications because we have to like peacock or something, of like,
Mhm.
look at me and what I've accomplished, and please give me a raise. But it is so different in the online business space. Like you said, you're just engaging in conversations with people, like you said, you and I met through the other project you were doing, talking about leaving academia, and there was no marketing, there was no sales, there was no element of, no one was trying to sell anybody anything. We were
Nope.
just enjoying talking to each other as two people who've had similar experiences. And I think you're absolutely right that if people can just speak about themselves and their work from a place of joy or from a place of passion, wherever they are, at the doctor's office, at the grocery store, on LinkedIn, whatever, that joy comes through. And I think that sticks out to people. Like they might not remember exactly what you do, but they're going to remember how much you love it, and they're going to share that with other people. So it definitely does not have to be defensive or like used car salesman marketing or anything like that. It's just
No,
sharing your passion with people. And I think that really, like you said, that pays off in the long term.
absolutely.
Well, this has been such a great conversation. How can people get in touch with you if they want to work with you or if they're interested in going into consulting or exploring that?
Yeah. Yeah. I think the easiest way and probably the most promising way is via LinkedIn. I I'm there often. I'm there at least daily. I post a lot. It'll also help folks get to know me a little bit more about what I'm about. You're welcome to reach out to me on LinkedIn if that works for you. But folks can also find me at my website. That's hire, HIRE, raretalent.com.
Thanks so much, Rachel. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
If you're unhappy in academia and you think you might be a good editor or writing coach, check out my course, Becoming an Academic Editor. This digital course is paired with a 12-week group coaching program to support you through your decision to leave academia or not, and to start building a profitable and rewarding academic editing business. Learn more by going to acadiaediting.com/become an editor. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you next time.